Hello again and happy Sunday to all of you. Tomorrow, on July the 27th, 2020, exactly 40 years will come to pass since the deposed last Shah, meaning king and emperor of Iran. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi died in exile, more specifically in Cairo, the Egyptian capital, because the Egyptian president Anwar el-Sadat had offered him a political asylum. He had actually had to hop from one country to another one. He had been suffering from cancer since 1978. He was only operated on in late 1979, which was then far too late as far as his health was concerned. And during the 1.5 years that passed since he fled Iran because of the Islamic Revolution in January 1979 to his death in exile in July 1980, he was a fugitive, albeit an imperial fugitive. And as we know, on November the 4th, 1979, under 10 months after he had fled into exile, a group of fanatical Iranian Muslims stormed the US embassy in Tehran, Iran's capital, and then took its personnel hostage. And almost all of those hostages were held there until January the 20th, 1981, when the next US president, Ronald Reagan, was inaugurated. And indeed, there has been speculation that some members of Reagan's presidential campaign were in secret contact with some agents of the Iranian Muslim government, or Islamic government rather, and arranged it so that Carter would be unable to bring the hostages back to the United States before November the 4th, 1980, which was the date of that year's US presidential election. And as we know, Reagan clearly won Carter in that election, and then Reagan got the credit in most Americans' minds, despite the fact that Carter had worked hard, even after his presidential election defeat, for the last 2.5 months of his presidency to bring the hostages back. He was able to visit them, I think, in West Germany of that time, having just become a former US president, while Reagan then got the political credit. By that time, the ultimately stalemated or unsolved Iraqi-Iranian war had already started. It started in late September 1980 and would end in an armistice almost 8 years later in August 1988. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was officially a Shiite Muslim. However, in his personal lifestyle and in the lifestyles that he allowed in the courts and generally speaking in Iran, he was a rather liberal and secular Muslim. He was notorious for his extramarital affairs, and indeed he had 3 wives, the last of whom, the former Empress Farah Diba, is still alive. His middle wife, Soraya, who was of mixed Iranian-German origin, eventually had to agree to a divorce because she could not, even with the doctor's help, conceive a child. The first wife, an Egyptian princess, never felt at home in Iran and was actually happy to return to Egypt. In June 1970, so 8.5 years before his overthrow and 10 years before his death, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi and Empress Farah Diba visited my distant native land, Finland, in Northern Europe. That visit was marked by rather big, by the Finnish standards, mostly left-wing young people's and even older adults, demonstrations against the tyrant and oppressor of Persia, as he was called. Obviously, he was kept within a safe distance from the demonstrators, and he at least pretended to ignore the demonstrators. And then quite many young people and some young adults were taken into custody by the Finnish police officers. Even though he was considered a Western-minded Middle Eastern ruler, in 1977, when he visited the United States, he accused the Americans of being too greedy for the Iranian oil. And he threatened to cut the oil supply progressively to the United States. In his court and among his family members, he preferred to speak French, and he liked the company of European or European-born women. He was self-conscious about his height, which, according to a French version of the Wikipedia, has been estimated at either 1 meter 70 centimeters or 5 feet 7 inches, or 1 meter 76 centimeters, or not quite 5 feet 9.5 inches. He was, however, trim and athletic throughout his adult life. And because of his height, he wore elevator shoes in order to look taller. So let's read more about him. He was the oldest son of Reza Shah Pahlavi, an army officer who became the ruler of Iran and founder of the Pahlavi dynasty in 1925. Mohammad Reza was educated in Switzerland, Central Europe, and returned to Iran in 1935. In 1941, the Soviet Union and Britain, fearing that the Shah would cooperate with Nazi Germany to make Iran fully independent of the Soviet and British influence, occupied Iran and forced Reza Shah into exile, and Mohammad Reza was then proclaimed the new Shah of Iran in September 1941. In the early 1950s, he struggled for control of the Iranian government between himself and Mr. Mohammad Mossadegh, a zealous Iranian nationalist. In March 1951, Mossadegh was the prime minister or the head of government, secured passage of a bill in the Majlis or Parliament of Iran to nationalize the vast British petroleum interests in Iran, petroleum meaning oil. Mossadegh's power grew rapidly, and by the end of April 1951, Mohammad Reza had been forced to appoint Mossadegh as prime minister. In August 1953, Shah Mohammad Reza tried and failed to dismiss Mossadegh, and after riots broke out, fled the country. Several days later, however, Mossadegh's opponents, with the US and British hidden support and assistance, restored Mohammad Reza to power. The Iranian oil industry's nationalization was nominally maintained, although in 1954 Iran entered into an agreement to split revenues with a newly formed international consortium that was responsible for managing production. Again, with US assistance, Mohammad Reza proceeded to carry out a national development program called the White Revolution that included construction of new roads, railways, and even airports and airfields, a number of dam and irrigation projects, the eradication of diseases such as malaria, the encouragement and support of industrial growth, and land reform. Illiteracy was quite radically cut in Iran during his rule, and healthcare also improved, at least to some extent. In the 1960s and 1970s, the Shah tried to develop a more independent foreign policy, and he improved the Iranian relationships with the Soviet Union and Eastern European countries. Although the White Revolution did temporarily increase support for the Shah, he faced continuing political criticism from those who felt that either he did not go far enough or fast enough, or that he was actually weakening Islam. And since the early 1960s, he ruled as an autocrat without an effective government or parliament, and eventually the opposition parties were disallowed. Only the Rastakhiz party was allowed. Also, his government was seen as corrupt, and that was largely true. The oil wealth was unequally distributed. Many Iranians felt that westernization was rammed down their throats. And then the notorious secret police of Iran in the Shah's service, Sabak, suppressed dissent and opposition to his rule. Iran began to reap greater revenues from its petroleum exports beginning in 1973, the first oil crisis. But despite that, opposition to the Shah spread also among the Shiite clergy, bazaar merchants, and students. In 1978, they started to demand the Shah's overthrow and Iran's Islamicization, and also the return of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a Shiite religious leader who was then living in exile in Paris, France. 4 successive governments were brought down by the rioting, and after several months of rioting and and his seeming inability or growing inability to regain control of Iran, he left the country on January the 16th, 1979, with his family. And he then had to sort of hopscotch. He had already been diagnosed with cancer in 1974, and it worsened, the disease worsened starting in the spring of 1978, and he stopped making public appearances. He spent the entire summer of 1978 at his Caspian Sea resort. The Caspian Sea is a large inland salt lake in Western and Central Asia, where 2 of France's most prominent doctors, Jean Bernard and Georges Flandrin, treated his cancer. They prescribed him with prednisone, a drug that can cause depression and impair thinking, although they thought that it might be, or hoped that it might be, an effective medicine against his cancer. Following his exile, he first fled to Aswan, Egypt, where he was warmly and graciously welcomed by President Anwar el-Sadat. Then he lived in Marrakesh, Morocco, as a guest of King Hassan II. Then he lived in Paradise Island in the Bahamas and in Cuernavaca, Mexico, near Mexico City, as a guest of President Jose Lopez Portillo. In the summer of 1979, an American doctor, Benjamin Keane, provided a bleak analysis of the former Shah's medical condition. The Shah's appearance was stunningly worse. Clearly, he had obstructive jaundice. The odds favored gallstones since his fever, chills, and abdominal distress suggested an infection of the biliary tract. Also, he had a history of indigestion. Besides the probable obstruction, he now had been deeply jaundiced for 6 to 8 weeks. He was emaciated, in other words, thinned. He looked even thinner and was even thinner than before, and suffering from hard tumor nodes in the neck and a swollen spleen, signs that his cancer was worsening, and he had severe anemia and very low white blood counts. The Shah needed to be operated on urgently because of his gallstones. He insisted on being treated in the United States, although he could have been treated in Switzerland. President Carter reluctantly admitted the Shah eventually to the United States. Former US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, interestingly enough, phoned Carter to say he would not endorse the SALT II treaty that Carter had just signed with the Soviet Union unless the former Shah was allowed into the United States. As many Republicans, in anticipation of the 1980 presidential campaign, were attacking the SALT II treaty as an American giveaway to the Soviet Union, Carter was anxious to have the endorsement of a Republican elder statesman like Cancer to fend off this criticism. Mohammad Reza had decided not to tell his Mexican doctors that he had cancer, and the Mexican doctors had misdiagnosed his illness as malaria, giving him a regime of anti-malarial drugs that, instead of healing his cancer, caused his health to decline rapidly as he lost 14 kilograms or 30 pounds. Finally, on October the 22nd, 1979, President Jimmy Carter allowed the former Shah into the United States to undergo surgical treatment at the New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center. His nickname there was David D. Newsom, Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs at that time. By this time, Mohammad Reza could no longer walk, and for security reasons, he had to be moved in his wheelchair under the cover of darkness when he went to the hospital while covered in a blanket, as the chances of his assassination were too great. There are claims that Reza's admission to the United States resulted in the storming of the US Embassy in Tehran and the kidnapping of American diplomats, military personnel, and intelligence officers, which soon became known as the Iranian hostage crisis. Walter Cronkite, who was one of the best-known American television journalists at that time, had a running nightly television current affairs program called America Held Hostage. Under 2 months after being admitted, the Shah left the United States on December the 15th. He briefly stayed in Panama. This caused riots, and General Omar Torrijos, who was then the Panamanian dictator, kept Mohammad Reza as a virtual prisoner at the Paitilla Medical Center. The only consolation for Mohammad Reza during his time in Panama were letters from Princess Soraya, his second wife, saying that she still loved him and wanted to see him one last time before he died. However, Empress Farah Diba could not be present, which presented some complications as Farah was continually by his deathbed. Eventually, March 1980, the former Shah with his family returned to Egypt and received urgent medical treatment, including a splenectomy performed by Michael DeBakey. And at last, after several months of delay, on March the 28th, 1980, Mohammad Reza's French and American doctors performed the spleen operation, which, according to Dr. Keane, went beautifully. However, that night, the patient's condition worsened. The focus was on the Shah's cancerous spleen, grotesquely swollen to 20 times its normal size. It was 1 foot long or 30 centimeters long, literally the size of a football. However, Dr. Keane was drawn to the liver tissues that had also been removed. The liver was speckled with white, which meant that the cancer had spread to the liver and that the Shah would soon die. And indeed he did. In his hospital bed, the Shah was asked to describe his feelings for Iran and its people and to define the country. The Shah, a fervent nationalist, responded, "Iran is Iran." After pausing for a few minutes, he said, "It's land, people, and history, and every Iranian has to love it." Shortly after, the Shah slipped into a coma and died on July the 27th, 1980, at the age of 60. He kept a bag of Iranian soil under his deathbed. Egyptian President Sadat, who would be assassinated slightly over a year later, on October the 6th, 1981, at the military parade commemorating the 8th anniversary of the start of the Yom Kippur War, when Egypt and Syria had partly surprised Israel, although the Israeli army's intelligence officers had warned especially of the Egyptian attack. As a group of fanatical Islamic Egyptian soldiers forced a truck driver to stop and then ran across that land of space of hundreds of meters towards the balcony where the president was joined by tens of dignitaries, including cabinet ministers, army officers, and foreign diplomats. And tragically, Sadat stood up, thinking that those soldiers who were about to murder him by riddling him with bullets were actually going to honor him, pay homage to him. And standing up, he was an easy target. He was hit almost immediately, collapsed into a pool of blood, and died in a hospital a short time later. Mohammad Reza is buried in the Al-Rifai Mosque in Cairo, a mosque of great symbolic importance. Also buried there is Farouk of Egypt, Mohammad Reza's former brother-in-law. The tombs lie to the left of the entrance. Years earlier, his father and predecessor, Reza Shah, had also initially been buried at the Al-Rifai Mosque. Shortly after his overthrow, Mohammad Reza wrote an autobiographical memoir, Réponse à l'Histoire, or Answer to History. It was translated from the original French into English, Persian, and other languages. However, by the time the book was published, the Shah had already died. The book told his reign and accomplishments from his perspective, therefore it couldn't be considered an objective one. He placed some of the blame for the wrongdoings of Savak and the failures of various democratic and social reforms, especially through the White Revolution, upon Amir Abbas Hodeida and his administration. The Iranian women did gain new rights, which then were curtailed after the Islamic Revolution. Although he was in practice a rather liberal Muslim, he inherited an almost messianic belief in his own greatness and that Allah was working in his favor, which explained the often passive and fatalistic attitudes that he displayed as an adult. During his nearly 4 decades in office, he became a very wealthy monarch. While staying in the Bahamas, he offered to purchase the island that he was staying on for $425 million of that time. However, the Bahamas rejected his offer. The Bahamian government claimed that the island was worth far more. In October 1979, again in exile and perhaps knowing his illness's gravity, also possibly knowing that he would soon die, he split up his wealth amongst his family members, giving 20% to his third and last wife, Farah Diba, 20% to his eldest son, Reza, 15% to Farah Naz, 15% to his daughter, Layla, 20% to his younger son, in addition to giving 8% to Shahnaz and 2% to his granddaughter, Manaz Zahedi, or Zahedi. The Pahlavi dynasty had interests in, among other things, or enterprises, 17 banks and insurance companies, including a 90% ownership in the nation's third largest insurance company, 25 metal enterprises, 8 mining companies, 10 building materials companies, 45 construction companies, 43 food companies, and 26 enterprises in trade or commerce, including a share of ownership in almost every major hotel in Iran. The Pahlavis also had major interests in real estate. Mohammad Reza was interested in cars and collected 140 classic and sports cars. Let's see. According to Barron's website, this article was written yesterday on July the 25th, 2020 by Benedict Rey. The state funeral in Egypt took place on July the 29th, 1980, 2 days after the Shah had died. According to the Agence France Presse, a French news agency, right up to the last moment, flying in the face of criticism in the Muslim world and in his own country alike, the Egyptian head of state, Anwar el-Sadat, who was the president, remained loyal to the one he continued to call the Shah. Laconically, the state radio of Iran announced the former Shah's death. Official reaction was limited to parliamentary speaker Ayatollah Hashemi Rafsanjani, who described the death as a small problem without importance. Radical students who had seized 52 hostages at the US Embassy in Tehran in November 1979, demanding the Shah's extradition, said they were not interested in getting his body back. Anyway, at the funeral of the former or deceased former Shah, the Imperial Iran's anthem was performed, and Sadat then led a funeral cortege transporting the coffin draped with the Iranian flag and driven on a gun carriage drawn by 6 horses from the presidential palace to the Al-Rifai Mosque. Behind him followed members of the former imperial family, representatives of other deposed royal families, including Greece's last king Constantine, and thousands of Egyptian soldiers. No country sent its incumbent head of state. However, the United States, France, Britain, Japan, and Australia and Israel sent ambassadors. Among the mourners was former US President Richard Nixon, who had resigned in disgrace almost exactly 7 years earlier in August 1974. In his opinion, the US administration was shameful because of its hot then cold policy toward the Shah, who had been a loyal friend and ally of the United States for over 30 years. Under a heavy sky, the funeral cortege traveled for 2 kilometers across popular neighborhoods of Cairo, the Egyptian capital, that usually swarmed with people. Along with heavy security presence, some 100,000 people lined the route. On arrival at the mosque, Sadat and the former Shah's, or the late Shah's 2 sons, Reza Cyrus and Ali Reza, accompanied the body to the funeral chamber. A 21-gun salute was fired over the square.